Alright, so now let's put this to the test. Inside of our program, I've actually created this program up here, but I've intentionally broken all formatting on it. It's ugly and it's not pretty to look at. We're going to fix it up real quick. So looking here in Java, this is the Java version of it. You can see everything in here. If I run the program, hit OK, down at the bottom here says enter mark. So let's say 65, 87, and 32. Ouch. And we end up with a final average of 61.333336. Okay, so the program does work. It's just ugly to look at. So let's fix it. First thing we need to do is structure. We need to break it apart and make sure that the stuff that matches, we create our code blocks. We break apart all the things that belong together. Well, the first thing I see up here is this import is going to be all by itself. The next thing we have is the main. Well, the main is all by itself right now. It's separated from the import line. That's important. Creating of our static scanner. I'm just going to set that up. You notice when I press enter, it automatically indented. We'll fix that manually after this. Now down in here, we start looking at the actual logic of our program inside of our main. Now, what I want to do is I want to create our code blocks by looking at related data. So I see these three marks, and I know those marks are coming from a user. So I'm going to separate those because that's user input data. This num marks is known data, so I'm going to separate it as well. And these sum and average variables are data that's going to be calculated. So yes, they are all separate variable definitions. And they're all variable definitions, but they have completely distinct purposes. So I'm going to separate them. So there's their own sequential related code. So each one of these is a code block. Now down in here, I see 6 lines of code that ask for and retrieve the 3 marks. Those are all related. I don't need to separate them one at a time because they're all effectively doing the same thing. Their goal is to retrieve all 3 marks. So I break that one up. Now down in here, I have these 2 lines. Their goal, the sum and the average line, their goal is to calculate the average mark of the 3 tests. So I'm going to separate those. And then finally, we have our final output line that's going to go to the user. So I've created my code blocks now. Great. No problem. So now let's look at our white space, the other form of white space other than code blocks, and that is indentation. So I know that anytime I see these open squiggly brackets, everything inside should be indented. So I'm going to find this, and I'm going to just select it and hit tab, and that indents that piece. Now everything inside of these brackets should be indented. And all of a sudden, our program is already starting to look a lot more readable and understandable. I can see separate and distinct areas that are defining different purposes. So what I'm going to do right now is I know that I need to make a comment for every single block of code. So I'm going to look at, we don't need to do it for the import lines because we know that those are for libraries. But I am going to do it for all of my other blocks of code. So here I have my scanner line. So I'm going to put just my comments piece above there, and I'll separate this. Put my comment here, my comment lines. We're going to fill in the comments in a second. And you notice that I'm leaving space between each code block and the previous code block. And that's to separate everything, to keep everything readable. Now you might say, but you're adding so many more lines of code. The compiler doesn't care how many lines of code I have. It's going to break it down into binary, or byte code in this case, in the same amount of work. It's going to ignore all of our comments. It ignores all white space. It doesn't care. So we care about readability. So we're going to make our code as big as we need it to be to make sure that it is clearly understandable. The idea of fitting a whole bunch on one line is really useless. It makes no sense at all other than fill somebody's ego. There's no point. It doesn't serve the compiler any purpose at all. Just make sure your code is understandable by everybody, and that's all that really matters. Make sure your code is efficient. Less lines doesn't equal more efficient. That is a misnomer and shouldn't be there. Anyways, So before I add in these comments, I'm going to add in the header first. And the header should be the very first thing in my program. Now I told you there were two ways to create a comment. We can use a // There's a second way for multi-line comments. I can use a /* and I'm just going to close this, and it's going to end in a */. Think of those almost like opening and closing brackets. Anything in between will be ignored by the compiler, just as though every line had a // on it. So I'm just going to put all my information here. Author, and then after author we had file name, project name, and then creation date, and modified date, and finally description. And it's my job to go through each of these pieces now and fill this out. Mr. Lane, file name, main.java, project name. I'm still using our old interface demo from way back. Creation date. To be honest, I don't recall when we created this, so let's just put down September 9th, 2016. And modified date, today is the 26th, September 26th, 2016, and a description. So the purpose of this program, well, what is the purpose of this program? To calculate the average mark of 3 user-entered tests. Calculate the average mark of 3 user-entered test grades. Good. That's it. Header's done. First thing in my program, I move on. So now when we get into our comments, remember the purpose of a comment is just to describe what's going on in that code block. And the purpose on this one for variables is usually a description of what those variables are used for. Now, in this case, this is the input scanner used to retrieve data from the user. Store the 3 user-entered marks. Store the number of marks to be entered. And then store the calculated sum and average test mark. Now we see 6 lines of code here. Yes, I still only need 1 comment for all 6 lines because they're all related chunks. In this case, I am asking for, ask for, and retrieve the 3 test marks from the user. So I know exactly where the data is coming from. And next we calculate the average mark as sum divided by number of marks. And finally, display the final average to the user. So that's it. We've fully documented our program. It's a clean program. Anybody will be able to understand. Even if instead of reading all 6 lines of ugliness here, all they have to do is read this one simple comment and they know exactly what's going on in all of that code. It clears up our program and makes it easy to work with. So this is a bit of a longer video, but it covered quite a bit and it allowed us to really break things apart and understand how to section off our code. So just a couple little bit more piece of terminology. We have our header, we have our inline or code block documentation, we have our multi-line comments, we have our single line comments, we have our white space, which is in between each code block, and we have our indentation, which is also white space. So this is what we call professional practice, common things that are accepted in most professional environments. Thanks for listening.